Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well, Pui Lan.
I want to introduce Dr. John Thatamanil to members of my class. Dr. Thatamanil is Associate Professor of Theology and World Religions at Union Theological Seminary in New York. John and I have been friends for many years, and he is the author of the very important book, The Immanent Divine, God, Creation, and the Human Predicament. He has just completed another book that has a wonderful title called Circling the Elephant, which is a comparative theology of religious diversity. He's also working on other projects in search of interreligious wisdom. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to my class this morning.
It's my pleasure.
So I want to ask you, why are you doing this kind of exciting work in the field of comparative theology and constructive theology? Can you share with us your personal and intellectual journey?
Yeah. I think good theology, exciting theology, healing theology comes from the belly, from something existential, not merely the play of concepts. I came to the US when I was 8.5 years old and from India. And I had grown up in the St. Thomas Christian tradition, which, which is called the St. Thomas Christian tradition because we believe that Thomas, the doubting one, came to India in AD 52. So my family and my tradition thinks that we got off the boat with Thomas, that somehow we've been Christian forever. And there's some reason to believe that legend is plausible. But when you come to the U.S. as a Christian and as an Indian, it's hard to know what means to be Indian, distinctively Indian. What's special about being Indian? And for me, almost all of that was just loss and restriction. I couldn't date. I couldn't go to dances. All these sort of cultural things that Americans take for granted, I couldn't do. So, I had great food, but everything else was felt as a loss. So then I wanted to find out what it meant to be Indian in a deep way. And that is what led me to the study of Indian religious traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism in particular. I was fortunate because even in Sunday school, I had a teacher who introduced me to what was then called the religions of man, Houston Smith's book, which is now called The World's Religions. And there, when I read about Hinduism, I was deeply touched and moved. And that movement, that feeling of being claimed by a tradition, of feeling like I belong, this really began then. Mostly because Hindu traditions don't imagine God to be standing out there somewhere, uh, but radically immanent, as the title of my first book, um, acknowledges. So the sense of God as being nearer to me than I am to myself, that's in our tradition too, in Christian tradition too. But I found a new way of connecting to that strand of my tradition by seeing it articulated in Hindu tradition. So that's why this work claimed me in some way early, this desire to understand deeply what it meant to be Indian.
Yeah, you talk about you are not just studying, you actually participated in other traditions, ceremony or ritual. Can you talk about this kind of embodied knowing?
Yes. So uh, I think it'll be fun to share a story. When I went to India to study during my doctoral work, I was going there mostly to sort of work on my Sanskrit, learn the texts in some technical detail. But through accident and circumstance, I met a guru who was willing to not just teach me Sanskrit, but to read Shankara, a master teacher of the Advaita Vedanta tradition. I told him then, because I was still growing out of my Indian evangelical heritage, I said to Swami Paramarthananda, you know, Swamiji, um, I know that in Indian traditions, I'm to regard you as my guru, as the embodiment of the divine. But, you know, Jesus is my teacher. And he said, oh, that is fine. That is fine. Uh, so long as you don't have fixed ideas about this text, I am willing to teach you. And I said, good. But then as I began working with him and studying with him, I realized something was happening in my heart, that I was changing my disposition towards him, and he was becoming my teacher, my true guru, by showing me saving knowledge through Hindu texts and tradition. So suddenly, my neat idea, I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to learn about the other, but not be transformed by the other, that went out the window. Uh, and it felt anything but unfaithful. It was because of my love for him and his love for me as a student in the presence of these holy texts that something changed in me. And so now I am a regular practitioner of Buddhist meditation. I don't think I can understand what it means to be Buddhist by just reading Buddhist texts. If I'm to know as Buddhists know, I must practice as Buddhists practice. And in this way, I am in some small way becoming multiple and learning to embody the wisdom of more than one tradition.
This is a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing it. So we have been talking about interreligious dialogue in academia and also in some church settings for some time. But you are arguing interreligious dialogue needs not be just between Christians or Buddhists or Hindus. In fact, this kind of dialogue is very much in your own case, in your embodied self. That is why you are doing comparative theology. Can you share with us what comparative theology is?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways that people in this field talk about comparative theology, but comparative theology for me is learning with and from persons of other religious traditions. Now, it's true that many comparative theologians will not directly be in the presence of a person from another tradition. They might do it by reading those texts, but almost all comparative theologians I know don't just study texts. They often learn languages from persons of other traditions. That some of us actually undergo practice with people from other religious traditions. And in this way, our learning moves beyond mere cataloging of conceptual notions. You know, Buddhists think this way, Hindus think this way. No, we're trying to rethink what it means to be Christian, how we construe and understand God by learning with and from other religious traditions. That's comparative theology. For decades now, at least since the 1960s, Christians have said that God has disclosed God's self to people from other religious traditions. But then, if you really mean it, if you believe that God is in some way disclosing God's self to others, then don't you have an obligation, what some call a holy envy, to actually learn what God has shown to others? That's comparative theology. It's a way of operationalizing that holy envy.
This is a wonderful discussion about comparative theology, but some of the students may think, isn't it there is only one way or one truth? Because some of them have been brought up in churches that said, unless you are saved by Jesus, you will not have redemption. How do you help those students who are coming from that tradition or think like that to understand this discipline?
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in that tradition, in such a tradition too. I mean, in my particular Indian Christian tradition is very evangelical in many ways. We were influenced by British evangelical missionaries too, even though we have this legacy going all the way back to Thomas. So this is not new to me. I too grew up thinking this way. But what I came to see, first by in some ways rereading the biblical text and understanding the history of Christian theology, is that even as early as the theology of Justin Martyr at the end of the first century and the beginning of the second, you have this idea that the Christ, uh, the Logos that was made flesh in Jesus, is also found everywhere, and in other traditions too. So Justin Martyr talks about Logos spermaticos, the word Logos in seed form, being found throughout the world and in other traditions. And his ideas are rooted in the Gospel of John. John 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word is the light that illumines everyone. I mean, read those early verses in John. The light that illumines everyone is the Logos. Well, if that's true, then the Logos is busy everywhere, not just in Christian traditions. So that idea has been part of the Christian family of traditions for a very long time. And although it ran into some opposition that tried to monopolize the Logos, the Christ, only for Christians, if the Logos is only for Christians, the Logos is not Christian. I mean, it's not the Logos. A God who is for us alone is not God, because God must be that in and through which all things are created and sustained. So I think those are some of the things that I would say, that the Christ is not ours alone.
There are people who think that there might be possibilities for multiple religious belonging. You seem to have some critique of that idea. Can you talk about your idea of multiple religious participation?
Yeah, I think that belonging is possible. And not only is possible, I even think it might be the general norm if you look at the whole history of the human community. The idea that you can only be one religion at one time would have been incomprehensible to most human beings who lived in China and India. And the idea that there are these 7 or 8 religions, that they're all neatly bounded, constructed with huge Trumpian walls. You can only be inside one. You can't actually move across the boundaries, which are porous. All of these ideas about religions are like our ideas about race. They're of relatively recent vintage, right? You can only be one race at a time. And of course, then you organize these races in a hierarchy with some races being superior. We do the same thing with religions, right? Once we have identified the notion that each religion is neatly separate, tightly ordered, then you can rank order religions the way racists rank order races. And then, of course, your religion always ends up best. So in my book, I show that some of our ideas about race and some of our ideas about religions emerged at roughly the same time in the 19th century and were propagated by some of the same people like Hegel. So if our ideas about religion and our ideas about race are both toxic, if there never were these clean, neat boundaries between religions, if we have always been learning from and with each other, then why stop? Right? We are who we are because of what we have learned from others. We will be who we must be by continuing that process of learning. And for some of us, that will mean not just reading as others read, but practicing as others practice. So now, almost every day, I sit and do a kind of meditation that comes from the Tibetan Nyingma school. And it's by transforming my body that I come to see the wisdom of that tradition. The wisdom of that tradition will not be clear to me by reading of books alone. It's only when it becomes a part of my life in an embodied way that I will become someone who understands it as wisdom rather than as concept.
And therefore, you argued for a new formulation of theology of religious diversity. So can you talk about this Trinitarian understanding of the theology of religious diversity that your book talks about?
Yeah, and so my book says something new about the Trinity. It's a bit, I'm laughing because it's such a weird thing to say that anything new can be said about a doctrine that's been a matter of discussion for, many, many centuries now. What's new? But through my studies of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, I came to notice something that I hadn't noticed before. I now talk about three kinds of wonder: the wonder that there is anything at all, the wonder that anything that is radically singular, very distinctive, and the wonder that anything that is, no matter how singular, is only what it is by being in relation to everything else. So some traditions really thrive on the sense of, why is there something rather than nothing? What is the mystery of being? And some thrive on the notion of the singular, and some thrive on the notion of relation. Those of you who are listening with Trinitarian ears may hear there is a three going on here. Well, Buddhist traditions really dominantly thrive on the idea of relation, that to be is to be in relation. That is, for many Buddhists, a central idea. For theistic traditions, there's a real sense of the singularity of the world. God creates something distinctive. God creates each of us as distinctive. And God is God's self, something distinctive. And then for ground of being traditions, these include Hindus, Christians, and Buddhists, it's the mystery that there is anything at all that captures one's attention. So by surveying Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian traditions, I've learned to attend to this weird, wonderful, wondrous threefold of being singular, and being in relation. And for me, this is traceable to Christian discourses of, the first person, the second person, and the third person. So I've learned to see the Trinity differently by seeing what someone like Augustine might call vestigio trinitatis, a fancy word, which means vestiges of the Trinity or signs of the Trinity in all creation. So it's precisely by being attuned to this threefold mystery, by studying and practicing with Hindus and Buddhists, that I've come to see the Christian Trinity anew.
Which is very exciting, because when we are talking about Trinity, we usually just go back to the early Christian tradition and look at those theologians who have written from the Christian tradition. But you are inviting us, even basic concepts as God, as Trinity, or maybe Christology, we can also draw upon other religious wisdoms. And in your book, you certainly talk about different ideas about God. And in religious dialogue, sometimes it's easier to talk about God. That is, we can be more theocentric. As you said, the God is immanent. It can be found in more than one tradition. I'm teaching this class on Christology. Sometimes people think because Jesus was a particular person in a particular time, a Jew in Palestine at his time, then it is harder to understand. But since the work of Christ is related to salvation, and that concept certainly can be found in more than one traditions. Have you found interesting ideas to help us to understand better who Jesus was and what Jesus can be for us today, for example?
Certainly. I mean, in the book, I have an entire chapter on Gandhi and King. And that chapter is important to me for Christological reasons, because Gandhi generated a reading of who Jesus was that now we Christians have received back through people like King and King's teachers. So, for Gandhi, Jesus is the master of nonviolent resistance, satyagraha. For Gandhi, the idea of Jesus dying for our sins was never particularly interesting. He didn't quite understand how that worked, and so, unsurprisingly, it was not musical to him. But when he understood Jesus as the teacher of nonviolence and the teacher of nonviolent love, this was powerful to him. He learned to read this way through the help of many people, American Quakers, Leo Tolstoy, and then he started practicing it. And I would say that and not just me, many famous evangelicals even have said that the greatest disciple of Jesus in world history may have been a Hindu who never stopped being a Hindu. Well, that's mind-blowing, right? That you can have a non-Christian disciple. And that non-Christian disciple taught Christians to see Jesus as a master of nonviolent resistance, not just in turning the other cheek for one or two individuals, but for radical societal change. So here's an example of someone teaching us more about our tradition without ever undergoing conversion. He never converted in the sense of becoming a member of the church. But in another way, one could very well, and he would be happy to say it, he was converted into being a disciple of the nonviolent Jesus. So this is just one example of how our tradition can be given away, how others can learn from our tradition, and then teach us to see our tradition anew with Hindu eyes. So my Trinitarian approach mirrors that pattern. How do I learn to see my own understandings of God afresh? By being in communication and communion with people from other religious traditions.
For my students who are just beginning to study theology, how can they take steps to learn more about comparative theology, or what would your advice for them to think about?
Well, I mean, my intuition is that friendship matters. A number of theologians, I didn't really write a great deal about this because others already have written increasingly about interreligious friendship as one of the powerful ways that we can learn from other persons. We don't live in monocultures anymore. Almost every major city, certainly Atlanta, certainly the campus of Emory, you can see, monks in Tibetan robes walking down the campus. Our friends from other religious traditions are no longer on the other side of the world. Sometimes they're on the other side of the bed, right? Because of interreligious marriage. So I think I would commend the faithful, curious, humble business of cultivating interreligious friendship to learn from those who now are part of our lives. Often you can tell within minutes that the imprint of holiness is upon these beloveds who are now part of our lives. So I would say, first of all, begin concretely by nurturing the friendships that will be our greatest resources. But then we can actually also engage in disciplined reading of other texts. Right? All of not all, but many of the foundational texts of most of the world's religious traditions are now available in your local bookstore. And I would say, what speaks to you? Which of the traditions, for me, it was because I was Indian. It was going to be the Indian traditions, right? That spoke to me. Find something in the story of your life that draws you out of curiosity to a tradition, and then begin a humble apprenticeship of learning. For students or even pastors, reading one or two articles or finding a good companion to a classical text, like, there are really good guides to the Quran, there are really good guides to the Bhagavad Gita, and keep it by your study, your bedside, and just continue incremental learning. Even reading one or two articles a year over 5 years means that you'll begin to have more knowledge than many in your community, many in your churches, and then you can be a friendly resource and guide, a non-threatening person who, because you're trusted in your community, can speak out of your incremental learning.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Goodbye.
Thank you.